Good morning, and welcome to What's New in CabWriter 7. It's that time of year again where we're releasing a new version, and it has a number of new pieces of functionality which we want to describe to you in this video. We're going to start off with the rough lumber report. The model you see before you is a cope and stick frame and panel design. It has a lot of rough lumber. All of the frames for the frame and panels of the draw fronts, door fronts, back panels, end panels, so on and so forth, are hardwood, and in this case maple, and the panels are also hardwood, in this case curly maple. That makes for an awful lot of rough lumber. There may be other things in a model that uses rough lumber that aren't standard CabWriter components. And as long as you include those in the cut list scene, they will be included in the rough lumber total report. So let's see what the rough lumber total report looks like. In CabWriter 6, the rough lumber report was at the bottom of the RIP cut schedule, and it only included things like rails and stiles and things like that, things that were on the rough lumber report. In CabWriter 7, the total rough lumber report is up at the top, right here. And it includes any rough lumber that's in the cut list scene. Now that could be rails, stiles, frame and panels, the panels of the frame and panel, or anything else, but it might also include parts that are not normally CabWriter parts that you include in the cut list. In this particular report, we have two types of material, maple and maple curly, or curly maple. And of the maple, we have two thickness requirements, 5/4 and 4/4. Of the curly maple, we only have 4/4. This will be the total requirement right here in board feet. So for maple 5/4, we have 108 board feet. For maple 4/4, we have 136 board feet. And for maple 4/4, we have 168. Over here, you see something you've probably never seen before. It's called a waste factor. Now in most shops, especially when you're dealing with rough lumber, you have waste factors. A typical waste factor is 20%. And in fact, that's the default waste factor for CabWriter 7. I'll show you where that comes from in a moment. But you can have a different waste factor for every material name. For each name of rough lumber, you can have a different waste factor. And typically these come from experience in your shop. In this case, we've got a 20% waste factor for maple and a 25% waste factor for maple curly or curly maple. What happens here is this number already includes the total requirement plus an additional amount equal to the waste factor. So in other words, this is 125% of your requirement. Although that really is the requirement because you have to account for the waste that you will generate while working rough lumber. This is 120% of the 5 4/4 maple. Now let's see where the waste factor comes from. We've added a new parameter or default in the general section of the project tab, and it's called default rough lumber waste factor, and the default is 20%. In your list of rough lumber materials, as a default, you will see a waste factor of 20. And I'll show you what that looks like if you look at the extended entity info and go to the list tab choose rough lumber in the material list, and then look at any rough lumber. Cedar red number 1, the waste factor is 20%. Maple ambrosia, waste factor is 20%. All of them are 20% except those that the user specifically changes. And in this case, if I look at maple curly, notice it's 25%. Here's two things to remember. If I add a material to this list, for instance, suppose I add something called Joe's material, and I add it to the list. Notice that the waste factor is 20%. I can go look at another material, go back to Joe's, and it's 20%. I can change it to 30%, go look at somebody else's, go back to Joe's, and it's 30%. So the default waste factor comes from here. But anytime a user changes them, and they should, when you start a project, you should look at all the materials you're going to use and choose the waste factor you want. And save it. It saves itself automatically when you add a material or just change this number down here. I'm going to subtract Joe's material. Yes. And it's no longer there. But that's how you change a material's waste factor. And it's in the list tab of the extended entity info. The default you can change, but that's in the general section of the project tab, and the parameter is called default rough lumber waste factor. So that wraps this section up. Now let's look at another change. The DXF description text height. This section is called DXF description text height, but the actual parameter, which is in the general section of the CNC setup tab, is called DXF text height, and it has a default value of 0.7. Now this only applies to third-party CAM applications that you will use to do your tool pathing. What this does is it defines how high the text will be in that third-party application. And I'm going to bring up a third-party application, which is Cut2D Pro, just to show you what that looks like. Often these letters will be too small or perhaps too big. And so the way to control that is by controlling the text height in the DXF file. So as you import your DXF file into a third-party application like Cut2D Pro, you can change that parameter from say 0.7 to 1.2 or 0.5 and change the height of this description of this component. And that's all it does, is it just gives you a way to make sure that the descriptions in the third-party CAM application are readable. Okay, now we're going to talk about CabWriter settings help messages. In CabWriter 7, we made a fairly significant change to our help capability. It used to be in CabWriter 6 and previous revisions that in order to get help with the parameters, you had to go to the appendix of the user's guide. and look up the tab and then the definition of a parameter. In CabWriter 7, we made it a lot easier. It's right here in front of you. You can go to any tab, and if you want to know the definition of, say, cabinet style, just click the word. And it tells you what cabinet style is and what some of the options are. To get out of this, just click anywhere, and you're back out. You can go back in, back out. Now you can also go to section headings. We go to the Materials tab, and we look at the rough lumber section. It'll give you a description of the section heading and what the other parameters are within that section. And again, to get out, you just click. Some of the tabs have fairly large descriptions or pictures. For instance, if I go to the carcass groove width here, I got a fairly large description of what carcass groove width is, and I have pictures to demonstrate it. And notice, by the way, if a description flows over the height of the window, you get a scroll bar so you can scroll down. Most of these descriptions are just one line or two. Well, this one's more than one line. But most of them are just a line or something like that. It just describes what the parameter is. So there you go. We hope this helps a lot, so you don't have to be going to the user's guide, searching through the PDF, or going to the appendix and searching for the tab and then the parameter. It's right here in front of you. Okay, next thing I want to talk about is ladder base stretcher position. This is a very simple model. Just one cabinet, one base cabinet, a drawbank base. But if I look at the ladder base, traditionally our stretchers have been on the bottom. A lot of people have asked for us to have the option to put them at the top, and so we've obliged them. If you go to the carcass, if you go to the carcass and look at toe kick and look at a new parameter called horizontal stretcher position. Right now its default is the bottom, but we can choose top. Update, close, redraw the cabinet. And this time let's look at the ladder base. And notice now they're on the top. So that was a very simple modification, but a lot of people have been asking for it, and so we've delivered. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is edgebanding and optimization diagrams. This model is a frame and panel model, cabinet style, and the frames and panels are cope and stick, and so they involve almost entirely rough lumber, not sheet goods. But if we were to create CabWriter production documentation from this model and look at the optimization diagrams, which I will do now, And that's not an interesting sheet to look at, but let's look at this. You'll notice some red lines. And let me scroll down and get a more interesting view. Okay. Notice this is it's a 5 feet by 10 foot board, 60 inches by 120 inches sheet plywood. And there's a number of red lines you see. The red lines here indicate that that edge of this shelf is to be banded. And notice right here, notice here, this information that we have checked. It's called info, double pipe, and then banding. Well, the info tells us what dimensions have been oversized, and the banding tells us what edge has been banded. And right now there's only an F here for front edge, because these are shelves, and in many cases these are stretchers that have been rotated, and this is the front edge. If it weren't rotated, the front edge would be down here, but because it's rotated, this is the front edge. So it's indicating to us, the red lines are indicating to us what edges need to be banded. Now, like I said, all of the doors and drawers in this model happen to be rough lumber, so there's no banding on the doors and drawers in this model. But if there were, such as this model here, notice these are door fronts, and I don't see any draw fronts on here, but there probably are some. But notice they're banded on all four edges. So again, this is an indication of what edges need to be banded. Notice in this case that the banding label is LRTB, left, right, top, and bottom. So the left edge, the right edge, the top edge, and the bottom edge of these door fronts need to be banded. So that's just a visual indication of where you need to bending things, and you'll see that up here in the banding column. Notice LRTB, and if I go back to this one, you'll see in the banding column just F for front edge on these shelves and tops. So that's what we did for banding. And you'll see that, by the way, in both the optimized cut list diagrams, and if we go to the DXF diagrams, you'll also see it. And notice on the cut list optimized diagrams, this would be represented as just a rectangle, and the front edge would be shown as being banded. But on the DXF diagrams, the actual shape of the shelf is shown, and you can see here that now the front edge really means this edge and this edge, or this edge in the case of diagonal cabinets. So be aware of that. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is some simple changes to our CNC parameter defaults. Okay, this change, the CNC setup parameter defaults changed, is a nit, but I wanted to include it in this video to be complete. But in previous versions, called old here, this was a 3/8 inch bit. It's now a 1/2 inch bit. The other minor change is this parameter was wrong. There's no underscore before the D. And here there is. It's underscore D. That's just to correct the text here so that the label names are created correctly. But this is just a simple default change. Okay. So now what I want to talk about is how to create displaced ends or filler tool. Create displaced end or filler tool is this tool right here, which is right below the panel tool. And it says, gives you a tooltip that says create displaced end or filler. This is a really handy tool, and it's probably most handy for people doing frameless cabinet designs and designing them one box at a time. This is one such box. Notice in this type of design, what I've done here, let me look at the, let's edit the story stick. Notice the left end is a finish, left finish. And the right end is a finish. Further, I'm just going to cancel. Further, notice that the finish tools are unchecked. Or the finish style, I'm sorry, the finish style is unchecked. That will draw a cabinet like this. And the difference being that notice the doors and drawers, their fronts, overlay the sides of the cabinet. And of course leave a reveal. I can do the same thing. This is a normal frame and panel cabinet. And notice if I look at the door and drawer fronts, they actually stop of reveal from the inside face of the carcass. They line up with the inside face of the carcass. That's where the reveal begins and then the draw box. But in this other style, very similar to this frameless style, this is the same box as this, except I've used finish styles on both the left and right end and have not drawn the finish styles. Now I end up with the door and drawer fronts overhanging the side, leaving a reveal, of course, but overhanging the sides. This is a very popular way to do it in frameless designs. But the problem with that now is there are times when you want to add end panels and or spacers. For instance, if I were to draw these two boxes and leave some distance here, let's say 1.5 inches, and I set up my story stick to be, not my story stick, but my connector style to be 1.5 inches wide, I can now put a filler strip in there, and I can put end panels on it. And all of that's done using this tool. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you now. So to use this tool, all you have to do is choose any part of the cabinet, click on this tool, and that brings up a dialog box. The dialog box has 9 fields that you have to fill in. The top one you may or may not fill in. If I did not select a part of the cabinet first, this would be blank and I would have to supply it. But by selecting a part of this cabinet first, I no longer have to do that. It'll fill it in for me automatically. The next thing I have to decide is whether I want to draw something that goes on both sides, or only the right side, or only the left side. In this case, I'm only going to add something to the right side. And now I have to supply the length. There's two options, normal and extended. Normal will draw a panel here, or a sheet, and it will be your normal panel or sheet. It'll just go to here, just above the toe kick. But if I want it to go to the floor, I can say extended. And I'll do that one right now. This is not a filler I'm doing, it's an end panel, so this doesn't mean anything in this case. And so what I'm doing is I'm using the tool to create displaced ends. I could also use the tool to create a filler. Right now I'm not doing that, I'm only doing a displaced end. Now I can choose either to use the cabinet stored defaults, or I can use the current settings in the CabWriter settings. This first time around I'm going to specify, yes, use the stored defaults. Now these next two boxes define the material that's going to be used to make this displaced end. It will initially fill this with the type of material and the name of the material that's used for carcasses. But very often you want to create the spacers from a different type of material. Could even be hardwood. So you may want to choose rough lumber, maple, and then these will not be put, these parts, the spacers that is, the spacers will not be put on the sheet goods scene or in the DXF scene, but rather in their own scene or on their own layers. So now I'm going to say OK. And notice I got a displaced end. I got a couple of spacers here. If I look at the spacers using the extended entity info, notice that they're rough lumber maple. They're not what the carcass is, which is sheet goods, maple plywood. And the reason for that is you may have spacers that have a weird thickness. That's kind of the nature of spacers. They can be random thicknesses. CabWriter will try to calculate the correct spacer width and make them the correct width. It's your job in the shop to plane them down or whatever to that thickness. I should say thickness, not width, thickness. Now the other thing you might want to notice is that spacers go on a base filler strips tab or tag. Upper ones will go on an upper filler strips tag. So like I said, they won't, because they're on a different tag, they won't end up in the DXF scene when you create DXF scenes. The width of the filler strip, let's see, if you look on the panels tab right here, displaced spacer width is 3 inches. That's the default, but you can make them anything you want. So that's where you supply the default width for this filler strips. Okay. Notice this one went to the floor. And the toe kicks were adjusted for that. Now what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to put the same type of displaced end on the left side of this cabinet. So I'm going to choose left. I'm going to choose extended. It's going to be a displaced end. I'm going to use the stored default. And again, I'm going to make this rough lumber maple. And now I have one over here. Now I'm going to use the tool to put a spacer in here. Now I've already laid out these cabinets with a gap that's equal to the width of my connector style. And my connector styles will be drawn. By the way, let me just clarify something. When this cabinet is first drawn, if I go to CabWriter Edit Story Stick, notice the right end of this cabinet has a right finish, but finishes aren't drawn. And it had a left finish, but finishes aren't drawn. That's absolutely necessary to use this tool. So now I've got a gap between these two that's 1.5 inches wide. And I'm going to select any part here. You choose this tool again. This time I'm going to use the right side of that, and I'm again going to use extended. I'm going to use a connector style. I could, if it was up against the wall, if it was a cabinet that was up against the wall and I was putting a wall style in there, I could choose that. If it's up against another cabinet, let's say a refrigerator, I could use a finish style. Or if it's between two cabinets of the same height, I can use a connector. That's what I'm going to use here. And this time, I'm going to use this to place a filler strip. And I'll use the stored defaults. And I'll change this material again. And there you go. Now you got a filler strip in the middle of this. Suppose I didn't want it to go all the way to the floor. I could do the same thing. I'm going to use the right side. And I'm going to say normal, connector, filler strip, and yes. And again, I'll change the material. Say OK. Okay, now I've got my connector, but it's not going to the floor. And of course, during the cleanup phase, what I would have to do is delete one of these and extend the other one all the way down. Just a little cleanup. Okay. Now, this notion of extending things can apply to the upper cabinets as well. For instance, suppose I wanted to put end panels or end sheets on this. I could use the same tool. This time I'm going to do both. both ends. But I'm going to treat them differently. Let's say the right end is going to go up against a wall. And so I'm going to have it extend normally. But the left end, I want to extend to the countertop, because maybe that'll give me a place to stick a microwave in there or something. So I'm going to do displaced ends. I'm going to use the stored defaults. And I'm going to change this material to rough lumber, maple, and let me make sure I've got everything done right. Both ends, one of them normal, one of them extended. I'm not creating a filler here, so it doesn't matter what I have here. The tool function is the displaced ends. I'm going to use the stored defaults, and I've corrected the material. And here's what you get. Now, if you notice, the gap between this cabinet and this is the thickness of the countertop. So both the ends don't have to have the same treatment in terms of length. They can be different. So now I want to show you one other small feature. If I look at this, bring up the defaults, notice in the face frame, it's a pure frameless cabinet design. But let me go to the panels. Notice the panels say same as door for end panel style. And if I look at the doors, it's slab. But what if I wanted to put a frame-in panel here? You may or may not want to do that, but if you did, what you might do is change this to basic frame-in panel and close it. So now I'm going to do the same thing that I've done before with one difference. I'm going to do both this time. I'm not going to extend them to the floor. I'm not doing a filler. I'm doing displaced ends, but I'm not going to use the stored defaults because the stored defaults would tell me to put a slab on the ends or just an end sheet. But I've set up the current settings in CabWriter settings for frame and panel. And I'll make this material rough lumber, maple, and say OK. So notice now I've got the treatment of a panel on each end. I could have extended those panels to the floor. Now notice that the width of that style is 1.5 inches. And in fact, it's an end panel style. You notice that the thickness of my end panels are 13/16. Well, now I've got a gap of 11/16. But that's the thickness of this spacer. It's been designed and drawn as 11/16. So it's your job in the shop to use whatever material you're going to use for that and create a spacer that's 11/16. How you do that, the process you use in your shop, that's your problem. All right, that's pretty much that tool. Don't think there's much more to explain. So now let's move on We've taken this notion of extending things to the floor to our normal cabinets. So now I want to talk about drawing end panels and sheets to floor. That's a notion we already have with the refrigerator cabinet. Even though it's an upper cabinet, we can extend the sides of a refrigerator to the floor. So now we've implemented that in all of our cabinets, and I'll show you how that works in this next section. Drawing end panels and sheets to floor are rather easy. It's an extension of what we already have. If you look at the upper cabinet, refrigerator, we have two defaults here. One says carcass sides to floor. That we're not going to deal with on base cabinets. But the other says end panels and sheets to floor. It's the same name as the parameter that we now have for base cabinets. End panels and sheets to floor, right here, under the base general section. End panels and sheets to floor. Normally the default is no, in which case when we draw a cabinet, I'll put this aside. When we draw a cabinet, the end panels are drawn normally. They are not extended to the floor. To draw them to the floor, it's really easy. You change this parameter to yes. End panels and sheets to floor, yes. I'll update it and close it. And now I'll redraw this cabinet. But I'll say no. I'm going to use the current CabWriter settings, not the stored settings. And look at the end panels, in fact, are drawn to the floor. Furthermore, the toe kicks are adjusted so that they are not inset on the ends, but rather go all the way to the end panels. And any other adjustments that are necessary are made. That's more obvious down here. We've had to adjust this on the toe kicks to come all the way to the end panel. So this works with pretty much any style of cabinet. And it's really easy by just choosing one parameter and saying yes. So that was easy. Now let's move on to the next thing on our list called total or adjusted box dimensions in the box schedule. Total or adjusted box dimensions applies only to the box schedule that you get when you do a production documentation. Let's just look at these cabinets right now. If I look at the CabWriter settings for the upper cabinets, you'll notice that they're 50 inches tall, except perhaps the divided upper, which is 53 1/8. But all the rest are 50 inches tall. The base cabinets, the top of the countertop would be 36 inches, and if you subtract 1 1/4 from that, you get the height of the actual box from the floor. So when we produce production documentation, in the past and now, let me bring that up, we'll typically get a box height of 50 inches for upper cabinets or 34 1/4 for base cabinets. And if you add 1 1/4 to that, you get 36. But that's what you will see in the box schedule for box height. For box depth, you will typically see 13 inches for upper cabinets or typically 24 inches for base cabinets. Now, the box depth includes the distance from the front of the face frame, or in the case of frameless cabinets, the front of the door and drawer fronts, to the wall. So it includes what we typically call the face frame and the wall gap. So that's included in the box depth. In the box height, for upper cabinets, it includes that entire dimension from the bottom of what would be the face frame, or in frameless cabinets, the bottom of the door, to the top of the cabinet, and if they're face frames, typically the top of the top rail, or in frameless cabinets, the top of the door. And that would be the box height. So they're I don't want to call them gross box heights, but they're overall box height, including the door and drawer fronts and the face frame. Now, some people like to use this box schedule to actually specify the raw box dimensions. In other words, dimensions that don't include in their height. They don't include the toe kick. They don't include any bottom insets or any top insets, although they might include, if we extend the sides, they would include that, because that would be part of the actual box. But that would be the box height. In other words, for base cabinets, minus the toe kick, minus any inset on the bottom, and for box depth, it would be minus the wall gap and minus the face frame thickness. Similarly, for top cabinets, it would be minus the bottom inset, and if the top was inset, it would be minus that. If the sides were extended, it would include that. So this is the normal set of box dimensions we would get. I'm going to reproduce this now with adjusted box dimensions. So let me close this. And now I'm going to reproduce the production documentation. And notice this new field here. It says total box dimensions, and the default is yes. That will produce the box dimensions we just looked at. The overall dimensions, including toe kicks and insets and things like that. Wall gaps, face frames, that kind of thing. If I say no, and create production documentation, okay. I'm not going to bother looking at the sheet optimization, but I am going to go and look at the box schedule. Okay, now at this time, notice for box depths for upper cabinets, it's 11 and 15/16. Left off a lot of things. Left off the face frame. It left off the wall gap behind the cabinet. So now that's the basic raw depth of the basic box. The box heights were 48 and 7/8. That left off the 1 1/8 inset of the bottoms on upper cabinets. If I look at base cabinets, here's a base cabinet here, draw bank base. Notice that the base cabinet height is 30 and 34 and 3/4. I'm sorry, is 30 and 3/4. Now, normally it would be 34 and 3/4. And if you added the 1.25 for the countertop, it would bring it to 36. Here, if you add, here's what is missing here is the 4 inches of the toe kick. If I added the 4 inches of the toe kick, it would give me the 34 and 3/4 inch dimension we saw in the previous box schedule, but it doesn't exist here. The heights have been adjusted to get rid of the toe kick, and if there were any bottom insets, it would get rid of that too. And again, the depths are adjusted. Notice they're not 24 inches, but rather 22 and 11/16. In all cases, the box width is the raw box width from the outside of the box sides to the outside of the other box side. So this is just a difference in how we report boxes. This is just raw boxes, where the other report gave us the boxes with things like gaps, wall gaps, toe kicks, bottom insets, and things like that. So just be careful of that. And if you want these raw dimensions, they're easy to get, but typically you probably wouldn't. Okay, let's move on to another discussion. This one called New Oversizing Parameters. And it includes, in your PDF document that comes along with this, those two subjects are called Door and Draw Front Rail Length Oversizing and End and Back Panel Styles and Rails Oversizing. I'm going to cover those both here because all it is the addition of two parameters, or two sets of parameters. So let's look at what they are. They're both oversizing. The first parameter is right here, and it's in the Door and Draw Oversizing section of the Cut List tab. What this does is it allows you now on door and draw fronts to oversize the length of rails. We typically haven't been able to do that, but now you can. And the default for this is 1/8 of an inch. And it's that simple. The other are 4 defaults up here in the End and Back Panel section, oversizing section of the Cut List tab. There's 4 of them, and one allows you to oversize styles width, one allows you to oversize the styles length, and then the rails width, and then the rails length. And we've defaulted them all to 0. The reason being, most people don't oversize these, most shops. Some do, but the majority of our users do not. So we've made the default 0. And if you want to oversize them, you can place an oversized dimension in these parameters. That's it. And with that, we have explained the new functionality for CabWriter 7. And I hope you enjoy them and find them useful. And until next year, have fun with CabWriter 7.